My sister-in-law and her husband crashed at our house for 60 days without paying a single dime. Yesterday, when she casually announced they were extending their free vacation indefinitely, my husband simply nodded. But before I could snap, my 6-year-old son uttered one innocent sentence that brought the entire dining room to a dead, terrifying silence. My name is Eleanor. I am 32 years old, and up until last night my husband thought I was just a naive, stay-at-home wife making pocket change. He thought he held all the power. He thought he could manipulate my life and my home without consequences. He was catastrophically wrong. The boiling point did not happen overnight. It was a slow, simmering pressure cooker that finally blew the lid off during our 60th family dinner with my in-laws. 60 days of Monica and her husband Jamal living in my guest room, eating my groceries, and treating my house like an all-inclusive resort. I sat at the dining room table slicing a piece of roast chicken while watching Monica unapologetically uncork a bottle of Cabernet. It was a vintage bottle I had specifically saved for my upcoming anniversary. She poured herself a generous glass without asking and took a long, satisfied sip, leaving a red lipstick stain on the crystal. Jamal sat next to her, adjusting his expensive-looking gold watch. He was a smooth-talking man who always wore custom-tailored suits and commanded a room with his deep, charismatic voice. He called himself a venture capitalist, always pitching some new revolutionary startup idea to anyone who would listen. Yet for a man supposedly managing millions, he and his wife had been sleeping on my guest bed for 2 straight months, claiming their luxury condo was undergoing renovations. "This chicken is a little dry," Eleanor Monica remarked casually, pushing the meat around her plate with her fork. "You should really try marinating it overnight next time. I saw a recipe online that is totally foolproof even for you." I took a deep breath, keeping my expression completely neutral. I had spent all afternoon cooking after finishing my own work, but showing anger was exactly what Monica wanted. She fed on reactions. "Actually," Jamal chimed in, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, "we are going to need you to keep the grocery stocking up a bit. My new project is entering a crucial funding phase and I need optimal nutrition. In fact, I was just telling David earlier today that we are going to extend our stay. The renovations at our place are delayed. We will probably be here through the summer, maybe another 6 months." I stopped chewing. I placed my fork down on the porcelain plate with a sharp clink. I turned my head to look at my husband David, who was sitting at the head of the table. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes glued to his mashed potatoes, chewing slowly. For 6 months, I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "David, we discussed this. They were staying for 3 weeks. It has been 2 months. David finally looked up, his face flashing with irritation. "Come on, Eleanor," he sighed. "Jamal is on the verge of closing a massive seed round for his tech platform. Family helps family. It is a big house. You are home all day anyway, so it is not like it inconveniences you." Before I could open my mouth to completely dismantle his ridiculous logic, a small voice piped up from the end of the table. My 6-year-old son Leo had stopped playing with his peas and was looking directly at me with wide, innocent eyes. "But Mommy," Leo asked, his high-pitched voice cutting through the tension, "if Aunt Monica is taking over our house, can I bring my dinosaur bedsheets to our new apartment?" The silence that crashed down on the dining room was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that sucked all the oxygen out of the air. I froze, staring at my son. "What are you talking about?" I asked softly. "Who said we are moving to an apartment?" Leo pointed a small, sticky finger straight at Monica. "Aunt Monica told Uncle Jamal yesterday. She said this house is going to be hers soon anyway, so she gets to pick the new paint colors for my room. She said we have to leave." Jamal dropped his heavy silver fork. It hit his plate with a loud crack that made everyone jump. His smooth, confident demeanor vanished in an instant, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped panic. He shot a terrifyingly panicked look at my husband. David looked like all the blood had been drained from his body. His eyes darted wildly between Leo and Jamal. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He gripped the edge of the dining table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "What the hell is he talking about, David?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave. David exploded. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the wine glasses rattle. "He is lying!" David shouted, pointing an angry finger at our 6-year-old son. Leo, go to your room right now. You do not ever make up garbage like that at the dinner table. Leo burst into tears, terrified by his father's sudden rage. He scrambled down from his chair and ran crying up the stairs. My maternal instinct flared into pure, unadulterated fury. I stood up from my chair, ready to tear the room apart. Do not you ever scream at my son like that, I snarled, glaring at David. Monica immediately jumped in, waving her manicured hand with a condescending laugh. Oh, Eleanor, calm down. You know how kids are. They watch too much television and their imaginations run wild. I was just talking about picking out paint colors for our own condo, and he must have gotten confused. Stop being so dramatic. I turned my glacial stare toward her. You and your husband will pack your bags tonight, I said, enunciating every single syllable. You will be out of my house by tomorrow morning. I am done hosting this circus. I turned to walk away to go upstairs and comfort my son, but David lunged forward. He grabbed my wrist and yanked me back down, pulling me hard against the edge of the chair. The grip was tight enough to bruise. You are not kicking anyone out, he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of red wine and deceit. You are acting exactly like you did in college when you selfishly refused to pay off Monica's credit card debt just because you wanted to save for your stupid little backpacking trip. You have always hated my family. I looked down at his hand on my wrist and then up at his furious eyes. Let go of me, I whispered. He gripped tighter, leaning in. Let us get one thing straight, Eleanor. I pay the mortgage on this house. I go to a real corporate office every single day and work my fingers to the bone to provide this lifestyle. You sit around in your pajamas doing little data entry tasks for freelance pennies. You do not own this house. You do not pay the bills. I am the man of this house and I decide who stays under my roof. My sister and Jamal are staying. End of discussion. He shoved my arm away, acting like a king who had just laid down the absolute law. Monica smirked from across the table, taking another sip of my expensive wine. Jamal let out a long breath, wiping his forehead with his napkin. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw a plate at his head, even though every nerve in my body demanded violence. A cold, calculating calm washed over me. When you are dealing with narcissists and manipulators, showing emotion is handing them ammunition. I simply adjusted my sleeve, smoothed down the front of my dress, and walked away. I am going to a hotel with Leo for the night, I said without looking back. Do not call me. I walked up the hardwood stairs, my mind operating with absolute precision. I packed a small duffel bag for Leo, grabbed his favorite stuffed dinosaur, and packed my own overnight bag. I wiped his tears and told him we were going on a fun hotel adventure, just the two of us. I carried him down the stairs, holding his hand tightly. As we reached the bottom floor, I told Leo to wait by the front door while I went back to the kitchen to grab his water bottle. The hallway was shadowed, the only light spilling out from the slightly ajar door of David's study. I stopped dead in my tracks when I heard muffled, panicked voices coming from inside. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath, and listened. You need to control your wife. Jamal was whispering, his voice entirely stripped of its usual smooth charm. He sounded desperate and cornered. She starts digging around and this whole thing blows up. I handled her, David replied with his voice defensive but shaky. She does not know anything. She is just throwing a temper tantrum. She will be back tomorrow acting like a compliant little housewife once she realizes she cannot afford a hotel for more than 2 nights. Just tell me the signatures are done, Jamal hissed, pacing the floor. I could hear his expensive leather shoes squeaking on the hardwood. The interest rates are climbing. The guys I owe are getting impatient. We need the payout tonight, David. If that money does not hit my account by midnight, they are going to come looking for me. It is done, David whispered back. I submitted the final paperwork this morning. The cash should be in our joint savings account by now. I will wire it to your company account right after she leaves. Just keep Monica quiet. I stopped breathing. The air in my lungs turned to ice. Signatures, payout, joint savings account. I backed away silently, retrieving Leo's water bottle and walking out the front door into the cool evening air. I strapped my son into his car seat, got behind the wheel of my car, and drove away from the house without looking back. My hands gripped the steering wheel with lethal intensity. I drove us to a high-end hotel downtown. I checked us into a suite, got Leo settled in the massive bed with a cartoon playing on the flat-screen television, and ordered him room service. Once he was happy and distracted, I walked over to the desk in the corner of the room, pulled out my laptop and opened it. David had made a fatal miscalculation. He genuinely believed his own lies. Because I worked from home, because I set my own hours, and because I never bragged about my income, he truly believed I was just doing administrative freelance work. He thought my income was negligible. He thought he was the sole provider. He forgot that his wife was a certified corporate forensic accountant. I did not do data entry. I unraveled complex financial fraud for multinational corporations. I tracked missing millions through offshore shell companies for a living. I was a ghost in the financial system, and my hourly consulting rate was more than David made in a week. I opened my secure banking application to transfer some funds to a separate account so I could put a retainer down for the most ruthless divorce lawyer in the city. I clicked on the joint savings account I shared with David. This was the account where we kept our emergency fund and, more importantly, the $45,000 we had saved for Leo's future college fund. The screen is loaded. I stared at the numbers. Available balance $12.00. A wave of pure maternal rage crashed over me, hitting me so hard my vision actually blurred for a second. $45,000. Gone. Wiped out completely. The money I had meticulously saved, the money meant for my child's education, vanished into thin air. I took a sharp breath, cracking my knuckles. If David thought he could steal from my son and get away with it, he was about to learn a very painful lesson. I bypassed the standard consumer banking view, logging into a secure terminal I used for my professional investigations. It took me exactly 15 minutes to trace the massive withdrawal. The money had not been slowly drained. It was transferred out in one lump sum earlier that evening while I was cooking dinner. The routing number led to a domestic limited liability company registered under the name Apex Ventures, LLC. I opened another tab, pulling up the state corporate registry. I typed in the LLC name. The registered agent was Jamal. The address listed was a post office box in a strip mall. I did not stop there. I ran a deep background check on the LLC's financial footprint, tracking its recent vendor payouts and wire transfers. Jamal was not running a venture capital firm. He was not funding a tech startup. Apex Ventures, LLC had 0 employees, 0 business licenses, and 0 legitimate commercial transactions. What it did have was a constant stream of outgoing wire transfers to offshore accounts in the Caribbean and massive deposits to an online sports betting syndicate. Jamal was a gambling addict. He was drowning in debt, owed money to dangerous people, and my husband had just stolen our life savings to bail him out. But why would David do that? Why would my arrogant, self-obsessed husband steal from his own child to pay off his brother-in-law's gambling debts? I stared at the glowing blue screen of my laptop, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with terrifying clarity. The hushed conversation in the study, Monica claiming the house would soon be hers, Jamal asking if the signatures were done. David did not just empty the savings account. He had done something much, much worse. And I was going to tear his entire life apart to find out exactly what it was. The morning sun breached the heavy hotel curtains, casting a pale light over Leo, who was still sleeping soundly, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. I sat at the small desk, my eyes burning from staring at financial records all night. The coffee beside me had gone cold hours ago, but my mind was operating with razor-sharp precision. David had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I closed my laptop, slid it into my leather tote, and gently woke my son. I dropped Leo off at his elementary school with a tight hug and a promise that I would pick him up right at 3. Then I drove back to the house that David so proudly claimed was his. I unlocked the front door and walked into the kitchen. David was standing by the espresso machine holding a ceramic mug. He looked up when I walked in, and his posture immediately shifted into a defensive stance. His jaw set, and his eyes narrowed as if bracing for a screaming match. He clearly expected a hysterical wife, throwing plates and demanding answers. I placed my keys on the granite counter with a soft metallic click. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. "Where is the $45,000, David?" I asked. He flinched. The sudden directness of the question caught him completely off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then took a sip of his coffee to buy time. "You went snooping through our accounts," he demanded, trying to redirect the blame. "I told you not to overreact last night, Eleanor. I moved the money for a temporary investment. It is a bridge loan." "A bridge loan," I repeated, tasting the sheer absurdity of the words. "You drained our emergency fund and your son's college savings for a bridge loan. It is high yield." David shot back, setting his mug down a little too forcefully. "You do not understand how these things work. Jamal is on the brink of closing a massive seed round for his platform. He just needed liquidity to show the angel investors he had skin in the game. He is giving us a guaranteed 30% return in 90 days. You should be thanking me. I am securing our future while you play around with your little spreadsheets." Before I could tear his pathetic lie to shreds, heavy footsteps padded down the hardwood hallway. Jamal strolled into the kitchen. He was a tall, strikingly handsome African-American man who always carried himself with an unearned swagger. Right now, that swagger was amplified by the fact that he was wearing my husband's expensive navy blue silk robe. The robe was slightly short on him, but he wore it like he owned the place. He opened the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of imported sparkling water, and leaned against the island, looking at me with a condescending smirk. "Morning, Eleanor," Jamal said smoothly, his deep voice echoing in the quiet kitchen. "I see David filled you in on our little joint venture." "There is no venture, Jamal," I said, keeping my gaze locked on him. "Apex Ventures, LLC, is a ghost company registered to a strip mall post office box. You have 0 employees, and your only outgoing wire transfers are to offshore accounts and sports betting syndicates. You are a gambling addict who just conned my husband out of $45,000. The color drained from Jamal's face. The smooth, confident mask cracked, revealing a flash of genuine panic underneath. He shot a frantic look at David. David stepped forward, placing himself between me and Jamal, puffing out his chest. "Are you out of your mind?" David yelled, his face turning a blotchy red. "You are making up insane conspiracy theories because you are jealous of my family. Jamal is a venture capitalist. You have no idea what you are talking about. You know nothing about corporate finance, Eleanor." "Do not be petty, Eleanor." Jamal recovered quickly, stepping around David and pointing a finger at me. "Women just do not understand the mechanics of venture capital. It takes money to make money. The tech sector moves fast. You have to be aggressive. By the end of the year, I will pay you back triple. You will be begging me to manage the rest of your money." I stared at the 2 men standing in my kitchen, utterly astounded by their delusion. They were patting each other on the back, standing on the ashes of my son's future. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A sharp, intrusive vibration that demanded my attention. I pulled it out, keeping my eyes on David. It was an automated fraud alert from my premium credit card, the card David carried as an authorized user. The message on the screen burned into my retinas. Transaction alert. $8,000 charged at Mercedes-Benz of Portland. Reply, yes, to authorize. I looked up from the screen. David was shifting his weight nervously. Jamal was suddenly extremely interested in the label on his water bottle. They had not just stolen the cash. They were using my credit line for a down payment on the luxury car Monica was currently driving around town. I did not have time to process the sheer audacity of the theft because the front door suddenly flew open, hitting the wall with a loud bang. The squeak of designer luggage wheels echoed through the foyer, followed by a sharp, commanding voice that always made my blood pressure spike. "Is anyone going to help me with these bags, or am I expected to do everything myself in this house?" My mother-in-law, Beatrice, swept into the kitchen like a hurricane. She was dressed in an immaculate cashmere twin set, her hair perfectly coiffed, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto me with customary disdain. She marched right past David, ignoring his surprised greeting, and stopped directly in front of me. "I got a call from David this morning," Beatrice announced, her voice dripping with judgment. He told me you threw a hysterical fit at the dinner table and actually abandoned your husband in the middle of the night, dragging my poor grandson to some filthy hotel just to make a point. You are an incredibly irresponsible mother, Eleanor. I am here to watch over Leo since you clearly cannot handle the basic duties of a wife. Beatrice, I said coldly, you are not staying here. I will stay exactly where my son tells me I can stay. She snapped back, moving past me to the refrigerator. David works himself to death to pay for this roof over your head. The least you can do is show some respect to his family. Monica suddenly appeared at the top of the stairs, still wearing her pajamas, holding a cup of coffee. Oh, good, you are back. Monica yawned, waving her hand lazily. Listen, Eleanor, since Beatrice is going to be staying in the other spare room, we need to move some things around. I told Jamal I cannot possibly do my morning yoga in the guest room anymore. It is entirely too cramped. We are going to turn your little office into my wellness space. My office, I repeated. Yes, your office, Beatrice chimed in, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Let us be honest, Eleanor. That paperwork you shuffle around all day does not bring in any real money. It is a hobby. David carries the heavy burden of supporting this entire family. You do not need a dedicated room just to play on your computer. Do not take up space from people who are actually trying to do big things. Before I could stop her, Beatrice marched down the hall toward my home office. Monica bounded down the stairs, following closely behind her, smiling like a child who just won a prize. I followed them, my heart hammering against my ribs. Beatrice threw open the door to my office. This room was my sanctuary. It was where I conducted deep financial audits, where I tracked millions of dollars for corporate clients, where I built a career that dwarfed anything David had ever accomplished. Beatrice did not care. She walked straight to my mahogany desk, grabbed a stack of printed audit files, and carelessly tossed them out into the hallway. The papers scattered across the hardwood floor like snow. There, Beatrice said, wiping her hands together. Much better. Monica, you can put your yoga mat right there by the window. I stood in the doorway looking down at the scattered documents. My anger had completely bypassed a boiling point and settled into a glacial, absolute zero. I slowly knelt down on the floor and began gathering the papers. Beatrice and Monica stood over me, practically glowing with satisfaction. They loved seeing me on my knees. They loved putting me in what they believed was my place. As I reached for a cluster of papers near the baseboard, I noticed a heavy white envelope lying upside down. It must have fallen out of the pocket of David's winter coat, which was hanging on the hallway rack right above me. The envelope bore the logo of a major national bank. I slipped the envelope beneath my audit files and stood up. David came walking down the hall, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He saw me holding the papers and smiled, a magnanimous, forgiving smile. Look, Eleanor, David said, softening his voice to play the benevolent provider. I am willing to look past your behavior last night. I know you get emotional. Just clean up the house, make a nice dinner for my mother and Monica, and we will pretend none of this happened. I will keep providing for you. I will keep putting food on the table. This house is my sweat and tears, and I just want peace under my roof. I looked at him, really looked at him. The sheer magnitude of his delusion was almost impressive. David firmly believed he was the sole provider. He believed his middle management salary, which barely covered our groceries and utilities, was the engine keeping our lives afloat. He lived in a fantasy world constructed by his own fragile ego. What David did not know, what I had kept entirely secret for the past 4 years to protect his delicate pride, was that my corporate consulting firm was incredibly lucrative. I made $35,000 a month. 4 years ago, when David was passed over for a promotion and plunged into a deep depression, I had quietly taken over the largest financial burdens. I set up an anonymous auto draft from a private offshore account to pay the massive monthly mortgage on this house. David thought the bank had restructured his loan to a miraculously low rate. He was too arrogant and too lazy to ever check the actual paperwork. I was the one paying for the roof over his head. I was the one funding his illusion of grandeur. I am so sorry, David, I said, forcing my voice to sound small and compliant. I will start dinner right away. His chest puffed out immediately. Good girl, he said, patting my shoulder. That is all I ask. I walked past them carrying my files and the stolen envelope into the kitchen. I set the papers down on the counter, making sure my back was to the hallway. I carefully slid my finger under the flap of the bank envelope and pulled out the crisp, formal letter inside. It was a notice of default. My eyes scanned the heavy black text. The mortgage on the house was 3 months past due. The bank was threatening immediate foreclosure proceedings. My mind raced. How was this possible? My auto draft had been perfectly calibrated for 4 years. The funds were cleared every single month without fail. I checked the account numbers listed on the notice. They matched our mortgage. But there was a second paragraph detailing a massive modification to the loan structure. A second mortgage had been taken out against the equity of the house. Attached to the back of the notice was a photocopy of the loan origination document. I flipped to the signature page. There, scrawled at the bottom, was David's signature. And right next to it, on the line designated for the CO owner, was my signature. It was a perfect, flawless forgery. I traced the curve of the ink with my fingertip. I had never signed this document. I had never authorized a second mortgage. David had forged my signature to pull equity out of the house. If he had not been paying the primary mortgage for 3 months despite my funds being automatically deposited, where was the money going? I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. The pieces of the puzzle were multiplying, and the picture they formed was infinitely darker than a simple stolen college fund. David had committed federal wire fraud and felony forgery. I turned around and opened the refrigerator. I pulled out vegetables and chicken, playing the role of the obedient, apologetic wife. I chopped onions and listened to the loud, obnoxious laughter echoing from the living room, where Monica, Jamal, and Beatrice were celebrating their absolute victory over my household. I let them laugh. I served them a beautiful roasted dinner, poured them wine, and nodded politely when Beatrice criticized the seasoning. After dinner, I offered to clean up. I told David I needed to grab a few more things from my old office before Monica completely took it over. He waved me away, barely looking up from the television. I walked into the room Monica had already claimed as her wellness space. My desk had been shoved into the corner. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a tiny high-definition nanny camera I had purchased months ago but never used. The lens was no bigger than a pinhead. I carefully nestled the camera into the foliage of a large artificial fern sitting on the top shelf of the bookcase, angled perfectly to capture the entire room, including the small hidden wall safe tucked behind a framed painting. I knew David, I knew his habits, and I knew his desperation. If he had forged my signature on a second mortgage, he was hiding the original document somewhere. He would never leave paper trails at his corporate office. The only place he would keep something that sensitive was in my personal safe, assuming I would never check it because I trusted him. I went up to the master bedroom, keeping my demeanor incredibly calm. I took a shower, put on my pajamas, and lay in bed reading a book until David finally came upstairs. He stripped down to his boxers, climbed into bed, and turned off his lamp without saying a word to me. He was punishing me with his silence, reinforcing his dominance. Within 20 minutes, he was snoring softly. I waited another hour, listening to the house settle into silence. I pulled my phone from the nightstand, turned the brightness all the way down, and opened the application linked to the hidden camera. The screen showed the dark office illuminated only by the infrared night vision of the lens. The room was empty. I watched the digital clock on the bottom of the screen tick away the seconds. At exactly 1:30 in the morning, the office door slowly creaked open. 3 figures slipped into the room, shutting the door quietly behind them. The infrared camera caught the glowing eyes and sharp features of David, Jamal, and Monica. David moved straight toward the framed painting. He pulled it aside, revealing the digital keypad of my wall safe. He hesitated for a second, then rapidly punched in my private code. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. He had known my combination this entire time. The heavy metal door clicked open. David reached inside and pulled out a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the desk. "Is everything in there?" Monica whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. David nodded, rifling through the documents. "I have her original birth certificate, the marriage license, and her passport. It is all here." Jamal stepped forward, leaning his hands on the desk. "You are sure about this, David? Once we submit these documents to the private lender, the second mortgage closes tomorrow morning. We pull $150,000 in pure equity out of this house. I am sure, David replied, his voice steady but tight with adrenaline. I submit the paperwork, they wire the $200,000. I wire you $80,000 to clear the worst of your syndicate debt, use $20,000 to clean up my personal mess, and the remaining $50,000 goes toward Monica's Mercedes. We clear the 3 months of back payments on the primary mortgage so the bank stops sending notices and nobody ever knows. And Monica asked, pointing a manicured nail at the ceiling indicating me. David scoffed. The second the money clears, we hand her eviction papers. I am filing for divorce on Friday. She has no income, Jamal. She is a freelancer. She cannot afford a lawyer, and she certainly cannot afford to fight me for a house that is completely underwater with debt. She takes the kid and moves into some cheap apartment, and we keep the house. Jamal clapped David on the shoulder, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his face. I knew you had it in you, man. You finally took control. Let us get this done. We split the cash and we kicked her out. I lay in the dark staring at the screen. My own husband, my child's father, was actively plotting to steal my identity, forge federal loan documents, plunge my home into catastrophic debt, and throw me out onto the street, all to pay off a gambling syndicate and line his own pockets. I locked my phone screen. I did not cry. I did not panic. I simply lay in the dark, breathing slowly. They thought they had backed a naive housewife into a corner. They had no idea they had just locked themselves in a cage with a predator. The morning sun breached the heavy curtains of the master bedroom. I had not slept a single minute. I listened to the steady breathing of the man beside me, the man who had actively plotted to destroy my life to save his own pathetic skin. I slipped out of bed, moving with the silent precision of a ghost. I got Leo ready for school, packing his lunch with a steady hand. David was still snoring loudly, oblivious to the fact that his entire world was about to collapse. I drove Leo to his classroom, gave him a tight hug, and promised we would have a special dinner that night. Then I drove straight to my secure downtown office. I booted up my workstation. David thought I was a naive housewife doing freelance data entry. He had no idea the level of security clearance and financial tracking software I had access to. Tracing the digital breadcrumbs of an arrogant, desperate man was child's play. I pulled David's phone records, credit card statements, and email logs. I needed to know exactly why my husband would risk federal prison for his entitled sister and her deadbeat husband. The answer was glaringly obvious and entirely predictable. I found a hidden credit card account David had opened under a slight variation of his name. The statements were filled with charges for luxury hotels, expensive dinners, and designer jewelry. David was having an affair with a 23-year-old paralegal from his corporate office. But the real twist, the piece of the puzzle that connected everything, was hidden in his deleted cloud backups. I recovered a text message thread between David and Monica dating back 3 months. Monica had caught him at a restaurant with the paralegal. The messages were pure blackmail. She demanded David fund Jamal's fake business venture, or she would send me photographs of him and his mistress. David was trapped. He stopped paying our primary mortgage to fund his affair and keep his sister quiet. When Jamal lost all that blackmail money to the sports betting syndicate, Monica demanded more. That was when David decided to forge my signature on the second mortgage. He planned to steal the equity, pay off Jamal's dangerous debts, and throw me out onto the street with nothing. At 10 in the morning, I sat across from Naomi, my attorney. Naomi was a shark in a tailored suit, the most ruthless real estate and divorce lawyer in the state. I slid the forged loan documents, the bank foreclosure notice, and the blackmail text messages across her immaculate glass desk. Naomi took one look at the paperwork and let out a sharp laugh. He forged your signature on a federal loan document to pull $200,000 in equity, she said, shaking her head. Eleanor, this house is completely underwater. With the primary mortgage 3 months past due, the bank is going to initiate foreclosure proceedings on Monday morning. I nodded, sipping my black coffee. I know. Let them have it. Naomi looked at me, a slow, wicked smile spreading across her face. We are not saving the house, she asked. Absolutely not, I replied. The house is a sinking ship and I am handing David the heavy anchor. I slid a second folder across the desk. I need you to expedite a real estate purchase. I am buying a new property in cash under a blind limited liability company. I want it in the ultra-exclusive gated community over in the West Hills. Security must be absolute. Nobody gets past the front gate without my explicit authorization. Naomi reviewed the funds I had transferred from my offshore accounts. Consider it done, she said. What about the fraud? I handed her the police report I had already drafted regarding the identity theft and wire fraud. File this with the authorities and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but coordinate with your contacts to hold the arrest warrants until Thursday. Why Thursday? Naomi asked, raising an eyebrow. Because Thursday is Thanksgiving, I replied. Beatrice is planning a massive family dinner. I want a full audience when the curtains close. I returned to the house just before noon. The atmosphere in the kitchen was thick with unearned arrogance. Jamal was pacing the floor in a tailored suit, practically vibrating with energy. He tossed the keys to a brand new leased Mercedes onto the granite counter. The fraudulent loan money had clearly cleared his account that morning. David was leaning against the refrigerator, looking incredibly smug, believing he had successfully pulled off the ultimate heist. Beatrice was standing by the stove, dictating her endless demands to Monica, who was sipping a green smoothie. Beatrice turned to me as I walked in, crossing her arms over her cashmere sweater. Eleanor, she announced, I have decided we are hosting Thanksgiving dinner here this Thursday. I am inviting 40 members of our extended family. I want everyone to see how successful David and Jamal have become. You will be responsible for preparing a full traditional feast. Do not embarrass us with your usual lazy cooking. I walked over to the sink and poured myself a glass of water, leaning casually against the kitchen island. A large family gathering sounded wonderful. I took a slow sip, making eye contact with David. You know, I was just reading the most fascinating article this morning, I said, my voice light and conversational. The authorities just busted a massive mortgage fraud ring downtown. Apparently, some desperate men were forging their wives' signatures to take out second mortgages. The sound of Jamal's heavy silver watch hitting the marble counter echoed like a gunshot. David froze his coffee cup, hovering inches from his mouth. Both men turned an unhealthy shade of ash white, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I smiled pleasantly, setting my glass down. It is crazy what people think they can get away with, I continued, completely ignoring their sudden panic. The article said the penalty for federal wire fraud and identity theft is up to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. They freeze all your bank accounts and seize your assets too. They even arrest the accomplices who receive the stolen funds. Just terrifying. Beatrice, oblivious to the sudden drop in temperature and the sheer terror radiating from her son, waved her hand dismissively. Criminals always get caught eventually. Now, about the turkey, I want it brined for 48 hours. I will not tolerate dry meat. Of course, Beatrice, I said, looking directly into David's horrified, panicked eyes. I will make sure everything is prepared perfectly. This Thanksgiving is going to be a day nobody in this family will ever forget. Over the next 2 days, I played the role of the submissive, obedient housewife with award-winning perfection. Monica paraded around the driveway, showing off the sleek silver Mercedes she had purchased with my son's stolen college fund. She took endless photographs for her social media, posing against the leather seats and bragging about her husband's incredible venture capital success. I watched her from the kitchen window, chopping celery with rhythmic precision. She was driving a vehicle financed by federal fraud, and she looked so proud of it. Beatrice shadowed my every move in the kitchen, criticizing how I chopped the vegetables, complaining about the brand of butter I purchased, and loudly lamenting that David had not married a woman from a better social background. I let her talk. I let her hurl every insult she could think of, because I knew she was unknowingly decorating her own son's prison cell. Every cruel comment she made only fueled my cold determination. David, however, was falling apart at the seams. The casual mention of the fraud bust had planted a seed of absolute terror in his mind. He jumped every time the doorbell rang. He constantly checked the front windows, parting the blinds to look at cars parked on the street. He could not eat. He could not sleep. Several times I caught him hovering near my laptop trying to guess the encryption passwords I had installed. When he finally gathered the courage to ask me about the article I had mentioned, I simply smiled brightly and handed him a bowl of peeled potatoes, telling him I could not remember which website had published it. Jamal was acting just as erratic. He spent hours pacing in the backyard chain smoking cigars and having hushed frantic phone calls. I knew exactly what was happening. The sports betting syndicate had taken their cut, but the interest on his massive debts was still accumulating. The stolen money was a temporary bandage on a fatal wound. He thought he was safe, but the paranoia was eating him alive. On Wednesday afternoon, Naomi called me on my secure line to confirm that the purchase of my new estate was completely finalized. The keys were waiting for me at her office. I had hired an elite private moving company to discreetly transport my essential office servers, secure filing cabinets, and Leo's bedroom furniture out of the house. I timed the extraction perfectly. I scheduled the movers to arrive during the 3-hour window when David was at his corporate office pretending to work, and Beatrice had dragged Monica and Jamal to an upscale boutique to buy Thanksgiving outfits. I stood in the center of the empty guest room, making sure not a single trace of my son's actual life remained in this toxic house. I left behind cheap decoy toys and old clothes in his closet so David would not notice the absence. I had slowly and methodically erased my true existence from the property, leaving behind only a hollow, fragile shell for them to inhabit. By Wednesday evening, the house smelled of roasted chestnuts and baking pies. David walked through the front door looking exhausted and pale. He loosened his tie, staring at me as I carefully arranged crystal wine glasses on the formal dining table. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. "Is everything ready for tomorrow?" Eleanor asked, his voice cracking slightly. I polished a wine glass until it gleamed, holding it up to the light. "Everything is absolutely perfect, David," I replied, giving him a warm, loving smile. "Your entire family is going to get exactly what they deserve." That night, after David went upstairs, and the house finally sank into silence, I stood alone in the dark kitchen and let the mask fall from my face. For 3 days I had performed obedience so perfectly that even Beatrice had begun to believe she had broken me. I had chopped vegetables while she criticized the angle of my knife. I had polished silver while Monica paraded through the hallway in clothing she had stolen from my closet. I had smiled at David while he watched me with the nervous eyes of a man standing over a trapdoor, trying to convince himself the floor was still solid. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. That was their final mistake. I carried a cup of black coffee into the small dining alcove and opened my laptop. One by one, I reviewed the folders Naomi had helped me prepare. The first file contained the forged second mortgage documents, the notice of default, the handwriting comparison, and the bank's fraud report. The second contained the forensic trail from our joint savings account to Jamal's fake venture company, then from that hollow shell to offshore gambling accounts and a luxury vehicle dealership. The third contained the recovered text messages between Monica and David, every blackmail threat, every hotel receipt, every demand that he pay for her silence. The fourth file was the one that mattered most. It was the Thanksgiving menu. Not a real menu, of course. I had designed it to look like one heavy cream paper, dark leather binding, elegant gold lettering on the front. To anyone at the table, it would look like I had hired some overpriced boutique printer to impress Beatrice's relatives. But inside each page was a weapon. Page 1 was the appetizer, the mortgage fraud. Page 2 was the main course, the affair, the blackmail and Monica's role in draining our household. Page 3 was dessert, the foreclosure notice proving that the house David had just promised to hand over was already a corpse waiting for the bank to collect it. I printed 40 copies. The printer hummed quietly in the office while the rest of the house slept. Each sheet slid out warm and clean, carrying another piece of their destruction in perfect black ink. I arranged the pages with the precision of an accountant preparing a hostile audit. Every routing number was highlighted. Every forged signature was circled. Every transfer had a timestamp. Every lie had a receipt. By 2 in the morning, the leather folders were stacked in neat rows across my desk. 40 beautiful little coffins. My phone buzzed beside my coffee cup. It was Naomi. Everything is ready, her message read. The warrants have been approved. The officers will not enter until you give the signal unless David or Jamal attempts to flee. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling the strange calm that comes when fear finally burns itself out. For years, I had been afraid of being seen as cruel, afraid of being called dramatic, afraid of becoming the villain in a story everyone else had written for me. But cruelty was not exposing the truth. Cruelty was stealing from your own child's future and calling it leadership. Cruelty was forging your wife's signature and planning to throw her out of the house she had secretly paid for. Cruelty was watching a 6-year-old boy ask whether he could bring his dinosaur sheets to a new apartment because adults had already discussed erasing him from his own bedroom. No, I was not being cruel. I was being accurate. I typed back to Naomi. Hold them until dinner. I want the entire table to hear the truth first. Her response came less than a minute later. Understood. Then we let the law walk through the door. I closed the laptop and walked upstairs. Leo was asleep in the guest room I had quietly moved him into while the others were distracted. His stuffed dinosaur was tucked beneath his arm, his face peaceful beneath the soft glow of the nightlight. I sat beside him for a moment, brushing a curl away from his forehead. He had no idea how close his father had come to stealing his future. He had no idea that the bedroom he loved was already tied to a foreclosure file. He had no idea that by Monday strangers from the bank would be changing the locks on the house he had grown up in. And he would never need to know the ugliest parts. By the time he understood this chapter of our lives, he would only know one thing: his mother protected him. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "Tomorrow is the last day, sweetheart." Then I went back downstairs and finished preparing the stage. I did not cook the Thanksgiving feast alone. That had been Beatrice's fantasy, not mine. Before dawn, I confirmed the arrival time of the premium catering team. They would come through the service entrance plate, everything with professional precision, and leave before most of the family even realized they had not eaten food prepared by the woman they loved to insult. I confirmed the floral arrangements. I confirmed the valet service. I confirmed the private nanny who would keep Leo upstairs during the confrontation and bring him down only after the officers secured the room. Every detail mattered. Narcissists love spectacle. They love witnesses when they believe they are winning. They need applause the way starving people need bread. So I gave them exactly what they wanted. I gave them 40 relatives. I gave them polished silver candlelight wine, a perfect turkey, and enough luxury to make Beatrice believe she had finally conquered my home. At 7 in the morning, David came downstairs looking like a man who had aged 10 years overnight. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his movements twitchy and uneven. He paused when he saw me standing at the kitchen island arranging place cards. "You are up early," he said. "I wanted everything to be perfect," I replied. His gaze dropped to the rows of carefully written names. "You really are doing this?" I looked up at him, smiling softly. "Of course. Your mother wanted the whole family here. Monica wanted to show everyone her new status. Jamal wanted an audience for his success. You wanted to prove you were the man of this house." His throat bobbed. "Eleanor?" "Yes." For a second I thought he might confess. I saw the possibility flicker across his face. Maybe the pressure had finally cracked him. Maybe some tiny buried part of him understood that he was standing at the edge of a cliff. But then his pride returned. He straightened his shoulders and forced a laugh. "Just do not embarrass me today." I placed the final card beside Beatrice's setting. "Oh, David," I said gently, "I would never take that away from you." He frowned, sensing the sharp edge beneath my tone, but Monica swept into the kitchen before he could respond. She was wearing my cream cashmere sweater. For one brief second, the sheer audacity of it nearly made me laugh out loud. She had stolen my wine, my office, my peace, and now she was literally wearing my clothes while preparing to accept my house as her prize. She twirled in the doorway, grinning at David, as if she were already the mistress of the estate. "Does this look too casual for Thanksgiving?" she asked. David barely looked at her. "It looks fine. It looks familiar," I said. Monica's smile faltered. Her hand drifted instinctively to the hem where my initials were embroidered in silver thread. She realized too late that I had noticed. I simply smiled and returned to the place cards. Jamal entered next, already talking loudly into his phone about investor confidence and strategic liquidity. The more frightened he became, the more impressive his vocabulary grew. He used words like leverage, ecosystem expansion, and capital efficiency, but all I heard was panic. His hands shook when he poured coffee. He checked the driveway twice in 10 minutes. He flinched every time a car slowed near the house. Good. Fear should always arrive before consequence. By mid-morning, Beatrice had taken command of the kitchen as if the catering staff were her personal servants. She criticized the height of the floral arrangements, the temperature of the gravy, the arrangement of the chairs, and the brand of sparkling water. She never once asked who had paid for any of it. In her mind, money simply appeared whenever David needed to look important. She had spent decades worshipping the illusion of male provision, never realizing the entire temple was built on my bank transfers. I let her perform. I let all of them perform. David played the exhausted provider. Jamal played the visionary entrepreneur. Monica played the elegant future lady of the house. Beatrice played the proud matriarch. Every one of them stepped willingly into the roles they had written for themselves, and I stood behind them holding the script for the final act. Just before noon, I carried the stack of leather-bound menus into the dining room and placed one at every chair. The table looked magnificent. White linen, crystal glasses, polished silver, candlelight. A Thanksgiving spread worthy of a family that believed it was celebrating power, tradition, and success. At the head of the table, I placed David's menu. To his right, Beatrice's. To his left, Monica's and Jamal's. Then I walked to the opposite end of the table and placed mine last. The position was deliberate. From there I could see every face, every reaction, every lie collapsing in real time. The doorbell rang for the first time at exactly noon. I looked toward the foyer, listening as Beatrice rushed to greet the first guests with a bright, triumphant voice. More cars were pulling into the driveway. More relatives were arriving. More witnesses were stepping into the room where David had planned to crown Monica and Jamal as the new masters of my home. I smoothed the front of my dress, touched the hidden recorder clipped inside my tote bag, and took one slow, steady breath. The evidence was printed. The warrants were waiting. The house was already lost. The execution was scheduled for Thursday, and the guest list was complete. The doorbell began its incessant ringing precisely at noon, and it did not stop for the next 2 hours. Over 40 of David's relatives poured into the house, bringing with them a tidal wave of loud voices, cheap cologne, and an overwhelming sense of entitlement. The foyer was quickly buried under a mountain of heavy winter coats and oversized boots. Cousins ran through the hallways, leaving muddy footprints on the hardwood floors, while the older aunts and uncles immediately migrated to the living room demanding drinks and appetizers. I remained upstairs in the master suite listening to the chaotic symphony echoing from the ground floor. For years I had spent Thanksgiving mornings sweating over a hot stove, wearing a stained apron, and enduring Beatrice's relentless micromanagement. I had played the role of the silent, obedient workhorse, ensuring the family illusion remained perfectly intact. That version of me was dead and buried. I sat at my vanity mirror, applying a sharp, flawless coat of crimson lipstick. I slipped into a tailored, structured designer dress in a deep, commanding shade of red. It hugged my figure perfectly, projecting an aura of absolute power and unyielding authority. I paired it with sleek black stilettos and minimalist gold jewelry. I did not look like a tired daughter-in-law preparing to serve a feast. I looked like a chief executive officer preparing to hostilely take over a failing corporation. I checked my reflection one last time, grabbed my heavy leather tote bag containing my financial weapons, and walked slowly down the sweeping staircase. The noise in the living room was deafening, but I paused on the bottom step to survey the battlefield. Monica was firmly in her element, playing the grand lady of the manor. She was floating between groups of relatives carrying a crystal wine decanter and laughing with exaggerated elegance. My eyes locked onto her outfit. She was wearing a soft, cream-colored cashmere sweater that draped flawlessly over her shoulders. It was a $2,000 Loro Piana piece that I had purchased in Milan last winter. She had brazenly stolen it directly from my cedar closet and was now parading it in front of the entire family as if it belonged to her. Across the room, Jamal had cornered David's Uncle Arthur and Uncle George near the fireplace. Jamal held a heavy tumbler of expensive bourbon swirling the amber liquid as he leaned against the mantelpiece. He was gesturing expansively, speaking in loud, confident tones about his incredible success. It is all about building a self-sustaining investment ecosystem, Jamal boasted, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. My venture capital firm targets high-yield, aggressive growth sectors. We identify the visionaries and we provide the leverage they need to disrupt the market. It takes a certain kind of genius to spot the trends before the rest of the world catches on. The uncles were nodding along, clearly impressed by the aggressive financial jargon pouring out of Jamal's mouth. David was hovering nervously near the kitchen entrance, gripping a beer bottle. His face was pale, and a visible sheen of sweat coated his forehead. My comments at the breakfast table earlier in the week regarding the FBI mortgage fraud sting had clearly taken root in his mind. He looked less like a corporate vice president and more like a hunted animal waiting for the trap to snap shut. I took a deep breath and stepped off the staircase, walking smoothly into the center of the living room. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, cutting through the ambient noise. One by one, the relatives turned to look at me. The conversations began to falter and die out. I had never dressed like this for a family gathering. The sheer audacity of my appearance demanded absolute attention. Beatrice emerged from the formal dining room holding a stack of cloth napkins. She stopped dead in her tracks, taking in my crimson dress and immaculate makeup. Her eyes narrowed into angry slits, and her face flushed with immediate indignation. Eleanor. Beatrice snapped, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. What on earth are you wearing? Where is your apron? The guests have been arriving for an hour and there are no appetizers on the tables. Who is monitoring the oven? You are supposed to be in the kitchen managing the turkey. I smiled, walking toward her with a slow, deliberate grace. I stopped a few feet away, keeping my posture perfectly straight. There is no need for an apron, Beatrice. I replied with my voice calm and pleasant, but laced with a chilling edge. The premium catering service I hired arrived through the service entrance an hour ago. They are currently managing the carving stations, preparing the organic sides, and plating the hors d'oeuvres. I decided I wanted to actually enjoy the holiday this year instead of sweating over a hot stove. Beatrice gasped, clutching the napkins to her chest. A catering service? Do you have any idea how much that costs? You are casually throwing away David's hard-earned money on absolute frivolities. This family appreciates a home-cooked meal, not some overpriced commercial garbage. You are incredibly irresponsible, Eleanor. I tilted my head slightly, locking eyes with my furious mother-in-law. David did not pay for a single crumb of food in that kitchen, Beatrice. I said, projecting my voice just enough so the listening aunts and uncles could hear every single word. I paid for the catering. I paid for the imported wine. I paid for the floral centerpieces. Just like I pay the mortgage on the house you are currently standing in. David has not contributed a single dollar to this Thanksgiving. A collective murmur rippled through the living room. Several aunts exchanged wide-eyed, shocked glances. David's face turned the color of wet cement. He took a panicked step forward, but froze, unable to contradict me in front of his entire extended family. Before Beatrice could recover from the public humiliation, Monica rushed over, attempting to defend her mother-in-law and reassert her dominance. You do not have to be so incredibly rude, Eleanor, Monica sneered, tossing her hair over her shoulder. Mom just wants a traditional family gathering. You are ruining the atmosphere with your horrible attitude. I turned my attention to Monica, letting my eyes slowly rake up and down her stolen outfit. That is a truly stunning sweater, Monica, I said, my tone dripping with sweet venom. Loro Piana cashmere is undeniably luxurious. It must be so incredibly soft. Monica lifted her chin proudly, entirely missing the danger in my eyes. It is. Jamal bought it for me at an exclusive boutique downtown. He spoils me. I took a small step closer to her, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial, yet perfectly audible volume. That is fascinating, Monica. Did the boutique also include my exact initials embroidered in silver silk thread on the lower left interior hem? Because the dry cleaner specifically noted that detail when I dropped it off last month before it mysteriously vanished from my private cedar closet. Monica's face instantly drained of all color. Her right hand shot down to cover the left hem of the sweater, a reflexive, guilty gesture that exposed her completely to every single relative watching the exchange. She stammered, taking a hurried step backward, but no words came out. The absolute silence in the living room was deafening. The golden daughter was wearing stolen goods and everyone knew it. Jamal, seeing his wife publicly cornered, tried to intervene and salvage his shattered pride. He stepped away from the fireplace, leaving the uncles behind, and puffed out his chest as he approached me. "Listen here, Eleanor," Jamal growled, pointing a threatening finger at me. "You are not going to talk to my wife like that. You are just jealous because my venture capital firm is pulling in massive profits while you are stuck pushing papers. We are building a legacy and you cannot handle it." I pivoted smoothly to face Jamal, the crimson fabric of my dress swirling around my legs. I gave him a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. "I am so glad you mentioned your venture capital firm, Jamal," I said, raising my voice so Uncle Arthur and Uncle George could hear perfectly. "I was actually reviewing some of the loose financial projections you left sitting on the kitchen counter yesterday. I have a rather technical question regarding your ecosystem." Jamal faltered, his threatening finger dropping slightly. "What are you talking about?" I crossed my arms, maintaining my absolute composure. "I am just curious about Jamal. How exactly does your brilliant ecosystem offset the immense federal liability of transferring stolen residential equity into unregulated offshore sports betting platforms? Is your return on investment heavily reliant on the upcoming basketball playoffs, or do you strictly play the horse racing odds?" The uncles by the fireplace let out audible gasps. Uncle George stepped forward, his face twisting into a scowl. "Sports betting?" George demanded, looking directly at Jamal. "I thought you said you were funding enterprise software startups." Jamal's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. Thick beads of sweat erupted across his forehead, and his eyes darted frantically toward the front door. His grand illusion had been brutally dissected and laid bare in under 30 seconds. David could not take it anymore. He rushed forward, grabbing my arm with a sweaty, trembling hand. He pulled me forcefully toward the hallway leading to the pantry, away from the staring eyes of his horrified relatives. "Eleanor, please stop," David begged in a frantic, desperate whisper once we were out of sight. He was shaking violently. "What are you doing? Mom just wants a nice holiday. You are humiliating us in front of everyone. Please just stop causing a scene." I yanked my arm out of his weak grasp, brushing the sleeve of my dress where he had touched me. I looked at him with profound, unadulterated disgust. "I am not causing a scene, David," I whispered, leaning in close so he could smell my expensive perfume. "I am just making polite family conversation. You should go eat something. You look like a man who knows he is about to lose absolutely everything." I turned my back on him and walked out of the hallway just as Beatrice, desperate to regain control of her unraveling event, began clapping her hands loudly. "Dinner is served," Beatrice shouted, her voice shrill and borderline hysterical. "Everyone, please move into the formal dining room immediately. Take your seats." The relatives, shaken and whispering excitedly among themselves, began shuffling toward the massive extended dining tables. Beatrice was marching around, frantically directing people to their assigned chairs, desperately trying to force the narrative back to a celebration of family unity and immense wealth. I followed the crowd, gliding gracefully into the dining room. I walked to the far end of the table, taking my designated seat opposite David. I placed my designer tote bag on the floor, letting it rest against my ankle. I could feel the sharp, rigid edges of the thick manila envelopes hidden inside. The trap had been sprung, the audience was seated, and the perfect stage was set. The final act was about to begin. The long mahogany dining table groaned under the weight of the extravagant feast I had financed. Silver platters of herb-roasted turkey truffle, mashed potatoes, and expensive imported cheeses covered every available inch of space. The 40-something relatives ate with ravenous enthusiasm, oblivious to the suffocating tension radiating from the head of the table. They laughed loudly, spilling expensive red wine and chewing with their mouths open, perfectly content to consume the luxury I had provided, while treating me like an invisible servant. I sat at the far end of the table, maintaining a serene expression, as I slowly cut a piece of organic asparagus. Across from me, at the head of the table, David was falling apart in slow motion. He kept aggressively wiping his sweating palms on his linen napkin. He drank his wine in large gulping swallows, avoiding my gaze entirely. Beside him, Jamal was equally rigid, staring at his plate as if it held a live grenade. Monica, however, had recovered her arrogant posture. She sat tall, adjusting the collar of my stolen Loro Piana sweater, casting smug, victorious glances in my direction whenever she thought I was not looking. Suddenly, Beatrice cleared her throat loudly and shot David a sharp, commanding glare. It was a silent but unmistakable order. It was time for the patriarch to perform. David swallowed hard, setting his jaw. He picked up his silver soup spoon and tapped it against the rim of his crystal wine glass. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the loud chatter of the aunts and uncles. The dining room gradually fell silent as dozens of expectant faces turned toward him. David stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket, and plastered on a smile that did not quite reach his terrified eyes. Family. David began, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. Thanksgiving is a time to reflect on our blessings. It is a time to acknowledge the people who lift us up and make us stronger. This past year has been a period of immense growth and incredible success for our household. He gestured expansively toward Jamal and Monica. The older relatives nodded approvingly, murmuring their agreement. I want to take a special moment to recognize my brother-in-law and my brilliant sister David, continued, his voice gaining a false layer of confidence. When Jamal and Monica moved in, they did not just bring their suitcases. They brought a renewed sense of ambition and vitality into these walls. Jamal has been a rock and a true visionary partner in our family investments, and Monica has brought elegance and warmth back into this home. They breathed life into a house that frankly desperately needed it. Monica beamed, leaning into Jamal, while Beatrice looked on with maternal adoration. Several aunts at the other end of the table raised their glasses in a silent toast to the golden couple. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to the delusional drivel. It was fascinating to watch a man build a pedestal out of thin air right before he fell off it. David cleared his throat heavily, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The celebratory tone of his voice suddenly vanished, replaced by an Oscar-worthy display of somber, forced pity. He finally looked down the long table, letting his gaze land briefly on my face, before he quickly looked away, addressing the gathered relatives instead of me. As many of you know, maintaining a household of this magnitude while managing high-level careers can take a severe toll, David said, shaking his head sadly. We all have our limits. Unfortunately, over the past few months, it has become increasingly clear that Eleanor has reached hers. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Forks were slowly lowered to plates. 40 pairs of eyes swiveled to stare at me. I did not blink. I simply offered David a calm, encouraging smile, silently daring him to finish his speech. Eleanor has been struggling. David continued, lowering his voice to a hushed, theatrical whisper, as if sharing a tragic medical diagnosis. Her mental state has become highly unstable. The stress of her little corporate job, combined with her inability to handle basic household duties, has pushed her to a breaking point. She has become erratic, paranoid, and deeply unhappy. It breaks my heart to see my wife in such a fragile state of mental decline. Aunt Martha, sitting 2 chairs down from me, let out a loud, dramatic sigh of sympathy, pressing a hand to her chest. Beatrice nodded solemnly, wiping a fake tear from the corner of her eye. They were eating it up. They absolutely loved the narrative of the weak, failing wife being cared for by the strong, benevolent husband. So, after consulting with Beatrice and the rest of the family, we have made a very difficult but necessary decision, David announced, projecting a tone of noble sacrifice. Starting tomorrow, Eleanor will be moving back into her parents' house indefinitely. She needs time away from the pressures of adult life to seek professional psychiatric treatment. We are sending her away so she can finally get the serious medical help she clearly needs to combat her delusions. The audacity of the lie was almost breathtaking. He was not just trying to push me out of the house. He was actively destroying my reputation in front of his entire bloodline, ensuring that when I left, I would be remembered as a crazy, unstable burden rather than the primary breadwinner who had funded their entire existence. But with Eleanor stepping away to a facility, this massive property requires proper caretakers. David proclaimed, his voice rising with renewed triumphant energy. We cannot let this beautiful home fall into disrepair. Therefore, Monica and Jamal have graciously agreed to officially take over the management of the household. They will be stepping up to run things the way a proper traditional family should. David reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a heavy silver keyring holding two freshly cut brass keys. They gleamed under the light of the dining room chandelier. He walked around the head of the table, stepping behind Monica's chair. With profound gratitude for everything you both bring to this family, I officially welcome you as the new masters of this house, David said. He dropped the keys directly into Monica's eagerly waiting palms. The dining room erupted into thunderous applause. The uncles whistled and clapped their hands. Beatrice actually stood up from her chair, wiping away genuine tears of joy as she applauded her successful son and her newly elevated daughter. Monica held the shiny house keys up in the air like a hard-won championship trophy. She looked down the length of the table, her eyes locking onto mine, with an expression of absolute venomous victory. She thought she had won. She thought she had just successfully evicted me and claimed $1 million mansion as her own personal prize. The applause continued ringing in my ears. I looked at the brass keys clutched in Monica's fist. They were keys to a house heavily burdened by a fraudulent secondary mortgage. They were keys to a property that was currently in a catastrophic state of default. They were keys to a sinking ship that the bank was legally seizing in less than 72 hours. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not defend my mental health in a room full of arrogant parasites who had been drinking my wine and eating my food all evening. Instead, I slowly pushed my chair back from the table. The scraping sound of the wooden legs against the floor was drowned out by their cheering, but David noticed. His applause faltered slightly as he watched me stand up. The brilliant crimson of my dress stood out sharply against the sea of muted browns and grays worn by his relatives. I reached down to the floor beside my ankle. My fingers found the smooth leather handles of my designer tote bag. I lifted it, placing it squarely on the pristine white tablecloth. I unzipped the main compartment and reached inside, feeling the thick, heavy weight of the manila envelopes Naomi had prepared for me. I pulled them out, dropping them onto the table with a heavy, unmistakable thud. The applause began to die down, replaced by a sudden wave of confused silence. I picked up the first envelope and looked directly at David. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or break down into the hysterical weeping he had just promised his entire extended family. Instead, I smiled. It was a radiant, blindingly bright smile that instantly caused the smug satisfaction on David's face to curdle into sheer terror. I reached over and picked up my crystal wine glass, tapping my manicured fingernail against the rim. The sharp, ringing sound commanded the room's attention once again. "What a truly wonderful speech, David," I said, my voice carrying a warm, melodic tone that echoed clearly down the long mahogany table. "It is so touching to hear how much you value family unity and transparency. You have all been so incredibly busy taking over my home and planning my future. So to celebrate this momentous changing of the guard, I have prepared a very special Thanksgiving menu for everyone here tonight." I picked up the stack of heavy, glossy folders I had pulled from my bag. They were beautifully bound in dark leather, resembling the expensive menus you would find at a Michelin-starred restaurant. I handed the first few to Aunt Martha and Uncle George, who were sitting nearest to me. I then walked slowly down the length of the table, passing a folder to every single aunt, uncle, and cousin. "Eleanor," Beatrice demanded, glaring at the leather-bound folder placed in front of her plate. "We already know what we are eating. You cooked it. Actually, Beatrice, I think you will find the contents of this specific menu much more difficult to swallow, I replied, gliding back to my seat at the far end of the table. Please, everyone open your menus. Let us start with the appetizers on page 1. The relatives exchanged confused glances, but the sheer curiosity in the room won over. 40 covers opened simultaneously. The heavy rustle of paper filled the dining room. Page 1 was not a list of roasted vegetables or artisan cheeses. It was a high-resolution, full-color printed bank statement paired with a forensic audit trace. If you look closely at the first course, you will see the exact financial autopsy of my husband's brilliant leadership. I announced, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. That is a bank statement detailing a fraudulent second mortgage pulled against the equity of this very house. Notice the signature at the bottom, the one the forensic auditor has clearly circled in bright red ink. David forged my signature to illegally withdraw $150,000 in cash. The dining room went dead silent. Uncle George adjusted his reading glasses, pulling the paper closer to his face. His jaw dropped open. But where did all that money go, you might ask? I continued pacing my words perfectly. Look at the highlighted routing numbers below the forged signature. $80,000 went directly into offshore shadow accounts belonging to an illegal sports betting syndicate. Accounts registered directly to our resident visionary Jamal. Another $50,000 went straight to a luxury dealership as a cash down payment for Monica's brand new Mercedes. Jamal's chair scraped violently against the floor as he shot up. That is a lie, Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Those documents are fake. She made them up because she is crazy. Uncle Arthur, sitting right next to Jamal, looked up from the paper, his expression hardening into pure disgust. It has your social security number on the wire transfer, Jamal. It has the exact vehicle identification number for the Mercedes parked in the driveway. This is a federal banking trace. Monica gasped, pulling her stolen cashmere sweater tighter around her chest. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for an escape route that did not exist. But wait, I said, raising my hand to silence the erupting whispers. Do not skip ahead. We still have the main course. Please turn to page 2. The sound of 40 pages turning in unison sounded like a thunderclap. You might be wondering why a supposed financial genius like David would commit federal wire fraud just to buy his sister a luxury car, I said, leaning forward, resting my hands on the table. The answer is on page 2. Those are printed screenshots of text messages directly from Monica's phone. A little gift from a data recovery program. Monica let out a high-pitched shriek, her face turning the color of chalk. Stop it, Monica screamed, lunging forward as if she could physically snatch the papers back from 40 different people at once. The relatives ignored her, their eyes glued to the glossy pages. The text messages were printed in stark black and white. They detailed a conversation from 4 months ago. It was the exact moment Monica discovered David was having a sordid affair with a 22-year-old paralegal from his office. Read the highlighted texts, Beatrice suggested sweetly. Beatrice was trembling violently. Her hands shook so hard the heavy folder rattled against her porcelain dinner plate. She stared at the words of her golden daughter's undeniable blackmail. Buy me the Mercedes, or Eleanor finds out about your little paralegal, Aunt Martha reading aloud, her voice echoing in the horrified silence of the dining room. Pay off Jamal's debts, or I am sending the hotel receipts to Mom. Aunt Martha dropped the folder onto the table, looking at Monica as if she were a venomous snake. You blackmailed your own brother, Aunt Martha whispered in horror. You extorted him to fund your lifestyle. They are parasites, I declared, my voice cutting through the rising chaos like a scythe. David thought he could buy their silence by stealing from me. Monica and Jamal happily bled him dry, trading his marriage and his freedom for an overpriced German car and a gambling addiction. They stood up here tonight and patted each other on the back for their incredible ambition, while fully knowing they were funding this entire charade with stolen money and blackmail. David was hyperventilating now. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his chest heaving. He looked wildly at his mother, silently begging for her to fix it. But Beatrice was broken. The grand illusion of her perfect, successful family had been detonated right in front of her eyes. The son she worshipped was an adulterous felon. The daughter she praised was a manipulative extortionist. The son-in-law she admired was a degenerate gambler. She clutched her chest, gasping for air, as a profound, humiliating reality washed over her. And finally, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper that somehow commanded the entire room. Dessert. Please turn to page 3. The relatives turned the page. Staring back at them was a massive official document stamped in bold, terrifying red ink. That is a notice of default and immediate foreclosure from the primary lender. I explained, watching the last remaining drops of blood drain from David's face. Because David drained the equity to pay his extortionist sister, he defaulted on the primary mortgage. This house is carrying a catastrophic amount of debt. The grace period expired yesterday. I stood up slowly, smoothing the skirt of my crimson dress. David just handed Monica the keys to a house he no longer owns, I said, gesturing to the shiny brass keys sitting next to Monica's untouched plate. On Monday morning, the bank representatives will arrive with armed sheriff's deputies to change the locks and formally evict anyone still inside. You are currently eating Thanksgiving dinner inside a foreclosed crime scene. The room completely exploded. Uncle George threw his napkin onto his plate, standing up and pointing an accusing finger at David. "You brought us into this mess," Uncle George roared. "You forged federal documents." Aunt Martha turned on Beatrice, her face twisted in scorn. "This is your perfect family, Beatrice. This is what you have been bragging about all year. A bunch of criminals and thieves." Monica burst into hysterical tears, burying her face in her hands while Jamal backed away from the table, looking frantically toward the front door. The illusion was entirely shattered. The wealthy, successful family they had pretended to be was dead, exposed as a rotten, hollow shell. I picked up my designer tote bag, slipping the strap over my shoulder. I looked around the room, soaking in the absolute devastation I had orchestrated. I had served them their truth, and it was choking them. "Enjoy the turkey," I said softly, turning toward the hallway. The sound of my voice snapped David out of his paralyzed state of shock. The realization of his total, inescapable destruction finally registered in his mind. He had lost his wife, his house, his reputation, and his freedom. He was facing federal prison, and his entire family had just read the evidence. The absolute humiliation morphed instantly into raw, uncontrolled rage. "You witch!" David screamed, his voice tearing through the dining room like a wild animal. I heard the violent crash of his chair hitting the hardwood floor. I turned just in time to see him vaulting over the corner of the dining table, sending crystal wine glasses and silver platters crashing to the ground. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. He lunged across the room, his hands reaching out to snatch the folder from my hands, his eyes locked onto me with violent intent. "Do not touch me." I did not flinch or step back. My voice cracked through the dining room like a whip striking the air with such absolute authority that David froze mid-step. His hands were inches from my face, trembling with rage, but he did not dare close the distance. Uncle George immediately grabbed David's shoulder, pulling him roughly backward. "Stand down, David." Uncle George barked, his voice tight with absolute disgust. "You have done enough damage for one lifetime. Do not make this worse." I smoothed the front of my dress, refusing to break eye contact with my soon-to-be ex-husband. I let the silence stretch, ensuring every single person in the room was hanging on my next move. Then I turned my gaze down the length of the long mahogany table, landing squarely on Monica. She was still clutching the shiny brass keys to her chest, her knuckles white, her eyes wide with rising panic. "Those keys are completely worthless, Monica," I announced, ensuring my voice carried to every quiet corner of the room. "You can stop clutching them like a grand prize. This house does not belong to you. It does not belong to David. It belongs entirely to the bank." Monica shook her head, stepping back until her hip hit the edge of the heavy wooden sideboard. "What are you talking about?" Monica stammered, her confident facade cracking into a million pieces. "David just gave us the house. He said we were taking over the management." "David is a compulsive liar and a federal criminal," I interrupted sharply. As of 8 o'clock this coming Monday morning, the bank is initiating a full commercial foreclosure. Armed sheriff's deputies will be arriving to secure the premises, change the locks, and drag anyone still inside out onto the curb. David ensured this property went into catastrophic default because he forged my signature to illegally withdraw $150,000 in cash. And he did it to pay off the massive underground gambling debts of the man standing right next to you. All 40 pairs of eyes swung instantly to Jamal. He had backed himself against the floral wallpaper looking exactly like a cornered rat. The arrogant venture capitalist persona had completely evaporated, leaving behind a sweating, terrified grifter. Monica stared at her husband, her jaw trembling violently. Gambling debts. Monica whispered, her voice barely audible. Jamal, what is she talking about? You told me the venture capital fund was expanding. You said we were closing a massive deal. Your husband is a degenerate gambling addict, Monica, I stated flatly, delivering the final crushing blow to her ego. He owes hundreds of thousands to a ruthless sports betting syndicate. David drained the remaining equity of this home to save Jamal's kneecaps and to buy your absolute silence regarding his affair with a paralegal. You are not the new wealthy masters of this grand estate. You are just two fools left holding the bag on a severely over-leveraged crime scene. The physical reaction was immediate and deeply satisfying. Monica's fingers went completely slack. The heavy brass keys slipped from her grasp, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp metallic clatter that echoed endlessly in the silent room. She looked down at the keys, then slowly up at Jamal, then across the table at David. A raw, visceral sob tore from her throat as the reality of her utter financial ruin washed over her. I reached into my leather tote bag one last time. I pulled out a thick bound stack of legal documents topped with a crisp blue cover sheet. I walked toward David, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. He watched me approach his chest, his eyes darting frantically around the room looking for anyone who might defend him or offer an excuse. There was no one. The entire family was staring at him with unadulterated revulsion. I stopped right in front of him. I lifted the stack of papers and threw them directly at his chest. They hit him with a heavy thud before sliding off his ruined suit jacket and scattering across the floor at his feet. Those are the finalized divorce papers, David, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial, unforgiving whisper. They are already signed, sealed, and filed with the federal court. I am taking full physical and legal custody of Leo. My assets are frozen and entirely protected behind corporate layers you could never even begin to comprehend. You will never see a single dime of my money again. Beatrice let out a strangled, horrific gasp from the other end of the dining table. She was gripping the edge of the mahogany wood so hard her veins bulged, her face completely devoid of color. But Eleanor Beatrice stammered, her arrogant, matriarchal facade completely shattered. You cannot leave. David pays for everything. You have always relied entirely on his income to survive. How will you possibly survive without his monthly salary? I turned to face my mother-in-law, letting a genuine, brilliant smile stretch across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had just won a brutal war they did not even know they were fighting. You really are completely economically blind, Beatrice, I said, letting a harsh, dry laugh escape my lips. You have spent years treating me like dirt beneath your expensive designer shoes. You called me a freeloader to anyone who would listen. You mocked my career. You elevated your mediocre, incompetent son to the status of a financial god, while treating me like an indentured servant. I walked slowly down the side of the table, forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. Let me make this abundantly clear for you, Beatrice, I continued, my voice ringing with total, absolute triumph. I have been paying the primary mortgage on this house for the last 4 entire years. I paid for the groceries you consumed. I paid the exorbitant utility bills. I funded every single luxury you thought your brilliant son was providing for this family. David's entire salary has been going directly toward maintaining his 22-year-old mistress in a luxury apartment and covering Jamal's illegal offshore sports bets. The shock in the room was absolute and devastating. Aunt Martha covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled cry. Uncle Arthur stared at David, shaking his head in profound disgust. The whispered conversations among the cousins erupted into angry demands for answers. You thought you were using a weak, quiet woman who needed your prominent family to survive, I said, leaning over the table to stare directly into Beatrice's horrified, weeping eyes. You thought you could treat me like a parasite while feeding off my hidden labor and my silent paychecks. But you were entirely wrong. I was the host keeping this entire pathetic illusion alive, and now the host is leaving. You did not manipulate me, Beatrice. You simply dug a massive financial hole and I stood back and let you all fall directly into it. You buried yourselves. Beatrice opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She clutched her chest, sinking heavily back into her dining chair. The grand, untouchable matriarch of the family had been thoroughly, permanently humiliated in front of her entire bloodline. Her legacy was destroyed. David dropped to his knees, scrambling frantically across the floor to gather the scattered pages of the divorce papers. "Eleanor, please!" David begged, his voice cracking with genuine desperate panic. "Please do not do this to me. We can fix it. I will get the money back somehow. I will fire the paralegal tomorrow. I will sell my car. Just please do not take Leo away from me. Do not leave me alone with this mess. You made this mess, David," I said, looking down at him with nothing but cold, calculated detachment. "Now you get to live in it." I turned on my heel, grabbing my designer tote bag. The uncles were already stepping away from Jamal, pulling their wives and children toward the foyer. The family Thanksgiving gathering had instantly transformed into an active hostile evacuation. No one wanted to be in the same room as the absolute radioactive fallout of David's federal crimes. Jamal was shouting frantically at Monica, trying to grab her arm to explain the offshore accounts, but she slapped his hand away violently. She was screaming at him about the stolen money, the fake venture capital firm, and the impending eviction. The dining room was rapidly descending into absolute chaotic hysteria. I walked calmly toward the front hallway, the crimson fabric of my dress brushing against the doorframe. I had packed Leo's overnight bag earlier this morning and secured it safely in the trunk of my car. My son was currently upstairs in his room, happily watching an animated movie with the professional nanny I had hired for the evening. It was time to collect him, walk out the front door, and drive to our new gated sanctuary in the West Hills. I reached the grand foyer and paused, taking one last deeply satisfying look at the destruction I had unleashed upon the people who had actively tried to destroy me. Just as David scrambled to his feet, opening his mouth to shout another pathetic begging plea, a new sound pierced the cold November air. It started as a distant, high-pitched wail echoing faintly through the quiet suburban streets. Within seconds, the sound grew exponentially louder, transforming into a deafening, piercing screech that vibrated through the floorboards. The violent wail of police sirens cut through the screaming and arguing in the dining room. The relatives froze in their tracks. David dropped the divorce papers, his eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated terror. Jamal backed away from the front window, his face completely drained of blood, his hands shaking wildly. The sirens abruptly stopped, replaced by the aggressive screech of heavy tires tearing up the driveway gravel. An instant later, harsh flashing red and blue lights illuminated the front lawn. The powerful strobe lights sliced through the darkness, sweeping violently across the dining room windows and painting the horrified faces of the family in alternating shades of crimson and sapphire. Federal wire fraud was never going to be a simple civil matter handled quietly in a divorce court. It was a severe felony, and Naomi had explicitly ensured the federal prosecutors had the physical address for the immediate execution of the arrest warrants. The grand finale had arrived right on schedule. The heavy oak front door of the mansion did not just open. It was thrown wide, revealing the imposing silhouettes of 4 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives. The flashing strobe lights from their cruisers bathed the grand foyer in frantic, aggressive pulses of red and blue. Walking calmly, right behind the line of law enforcement, was Naomi. My attorney looked absolutely immaculate in a sharp charcoal trench coat, holding a sleek leather briefcase that contained every piece of damning evidence we had handed over to the district attorney. The lead detective stepped into the dining room, his boots crunching over a shattered crystal wine glass. He held up a folded piece of paper, his eyes sweeping over the frozen, terrified faces of the Preston family. "David Preston," the detective announced. His voice was a flat, authoritative boom that instantly neutralized whatever violent impulse had possessed my soon-to-be ex-husband. David froze, his arms still outstretched toward me, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked from the detectives to the uniformed officers, whose hands were resting cautiously near their utility belts. The remaining color drained completely from David's face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out corpse. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the edge of the mahogany table. "I am Detective Miller with the Financial Crimes Division." The man continued, stepping further into the room. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of felony wire fraud, identity theft, and banking fraud." Jamal, realizing the trap had snapped shut completely, made a sudden, desperate movement toward the kitchen swinging doors. He did not make it 2 steps. 2 uniformed officers intercepted him, instantly grabbing his arms and forcing him roughly against the pristine white wainscoting of the dining room wall. "Jamal Davis," the second detective said, stepping up behind the officers, "you are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and receiving stolen funds. You have the right to remain silent." The metallic ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs locking around Jamal's wrists echoed sharply in the room. The absolute finality of that sound sent a shockwave through the gathered relatives. The aunts and uncles who had just been clapping for David and Monica were now pressing themselves tightly against the far walls, desperately trying to distance themselves from the criminals in their midst. Uncle George was actively shielding his wife, pointing a stern finger at David, as if to physically ward off his association. David was not fighting. All the aggressive posturing, the arrogant corporate confidence, the patriarchal dominance he had tried to wield over me vanished in a single breath. As the lead detective pulled his arms behind his back, snapping the heavy cuffs over his expensive tailored suit sleeves, David completely shattered. His knees buckled, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The officers hauled him back up, but he was limp, a pathetic, weeping mess of a man. "Eleanor," David wailed. Actual tears were streaming down his face, mixing with the cold sweat on his cheeks. He strained against the officer's grip, twisting his neck to look at me. "Eleanor, please. Tell them to stop. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. You can drop the charges. I will give you whatever you want. I will sign the house over to you. I will sign the custody papers. Please do not let them take me away." I looked at the man I had spent over a decade supporting. The man who had mocked my career, spent my hard-earned money, and paraded his mistress around town while demanding I serve his family like an indentured servant. "You cannot drop federal charges, David," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, chilling authority. "This is not a civil dispute. You defrauded a federally insured bank. You forged my signature on interstate financial documents. I did not arrest you. The United States government is arresting you. I simply provided them with the receipts." The reality of his impending imprisonment finally broke the last remaining thread of Beatrice's sanity. Her golden boy, the son she had weaponized against me for years, was being led away in chains. She let out a guttural, high-pitched scream of absolute denial. "You did this!" Beatrice shrieked, her face contorting into a mask of pure feral hatred. She lunged forward, her manicured hands raised, aiming directly for my face. She wanted to physically tear the victory away from me, to inflict physical pain because her psychological warfare had failed. "Do not touch me," I commanded, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a crack of thunder. I did not even have to step back. The female police officer standing nearest to the doorway intercepted Beatrice instantly. The officer grabbed Beatrice's raised wrist, twisting it firmly downward and forcing the older woman back against the heavy mahogany table. "Madam, you need to step back immediately or you will be arrested for assaulting a witness and interfering with an active investigation," the officer warned, her voice dangerously sharp. Beatrice collapsed against the table, clutching her chest as she sobbed hysterically. She looked completely broken, her designer dress stained with spilled gravy, her carefully styled hair falling wildly around her face. The matriarchal power she had wielded like a club had been stripped away, leaving a pathetic, enabling woman mourning the destruction of her own illusions. She had spent her entire life judging others based on their wealth and status, and now her beloved son was a documented felon. Across the room, Monica had dropped entirely to her knees. The luxurious cashmere sweater she had stolen from my private cedar closet was now dragging in a puddle of spilled red wine, staining the cream fabric with a dark, bloody hue. Her perfect makeup was smeared, running in thick black streaks down her cheeks as she watched the officers drag Jamal toward the foyer. "You cannot do this!" Monica screamed, her voice cracking with desperate hysteria. She crawled forward on her knees, reaching her hands out toward the detectives. "Please, it was just a car. Take the Mercedes. The keys are right there on the table. Just take the car and let him go. Please do not arrest my husband. We will give the car back." I looked down at Monica, feeling nothing but profound, icy disdain. She was trying to barter her way out of federal prison with a depreciating German vehicle. "The bank does not want your car, Monica," I stated, my words cutting through her sobbing pleas. "The bank wants the $150,000 your brother stole. And since you cannot produce it, Jamal is going to spend the next several years in a federal facility explaining his venture capital ecosystem to a very unforgiving audience. You dug a massive financial hole and you willingly jumped right into it." Naomi stepped forward into the dining room, her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. She surveyed the absolute devastation of the Thanksgiving feast, the broken crystal, the crying relatives, the handcuffed men. She handed me my tailored winter coat, checking her watch with professional efficiency. "The transport vehicles are waiting outside," Detective Naomi announced calmly, addressing the lead officer. "My client will be available for formal follow-up statements on Monday morning. We will let you secure the premises." I slipped my arms into my heavy wool coat, adjusting the collar perfectly. At that exact moment, my private nanny Maria appeared at the top of the grand staircase holding Leo's hand. She had followed my strict instructions, keeping him perfectly distracted and away from the chaos until the very last second. Leo bounded down the stairs, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur, completely oblivious to the legal destruction occurring in the dining room. I walked into the foyer, kneeling down to zip up Leo's winter jacket. I kissed his forehead, giving him a warm, reassuring smile. He giggled, wrapping his small arms around my neck. He was safe, and he would never have to grow up under the toxic influence of the Preston family. I stood up, holding my son's hand tightly in mine. I turned back to look into the dining room one final time. David and Jamal were being marched out through the service entrance by the detectives. The remaining relatives were frozen in silent shock, staring at me as if I were a terrifying mythical creature who had just leveled their entire world. Beatrice was weeping into her hands, refusing to look at me. Monica was still on the floor, sobbing into the ruined cashmere, completely paralyzed by her new reality. I let my gaze sweep over the wreckage of the Preston family. "You always love to remind me that family takes care of each other, Beatrice," I said, projecting my voice so every single relative could hear my final verdict. "So I suggest you start taking care of yourselves. This house does not belong to Monica. It belongs to the bank. And since the foreclosure notice is already active, I suggest you pack your bags quickly. But for tonight, Monica and Beatrice can sleep in this foreclosed mansion before the bank seals the doors on Monday morning. Consider it my final act of charity." I offered them one last, flawless, blinding smile. "Happy Thanksgiving." I turned my back on the wreckage. I did not look back as I walked out the heavy oak front door, stepping into the crisp, freezing November night. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the driveway, painting the manicured lawn in chaotic bursts of color. But I ignored them, walking smoothly toward the sleek black SUV waiting idly at the curb. The driver stepped out, opening the rear door for us. I helped Leo into his car seat, buckling him in securely. Naomi slid into the front passenger seat, giving me a sharp, respectful nod. I climbed into the back, closing the heavy car door, shutting out the sirens, the crying, and the last remaining echoes of my former life. The SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb, driving down the dark suburban street, carrying us away from the ashes and moving us rapidly toward our beautiful, unburdened future. The darkness of that November night faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the steady hum of tires on asphalt. I did not look back at the flashing police lights or the shattered illusions I had left behind in that dining room. I simply held my son's hand and watched the city skyline emerge before us, a glowing beacon of the new empire I was about to build. 6 months later, the morning sun poured across the expansive Italian marble balcony of my new home. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my double espresso, letting the rich, bitter warmth settle in my chest. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of jasmine from the gardens below. This was not a house heavily mortgaged to impress strangers or uphold a fake legacy. It was a sprawling modern estate nestled deep within a private gated community in the West Hills, purchased entirely in cash. Every stone, every pane of glass, every perfectly manicured blade of grass belonged exclusively to me. I leaned against the glass railing, looking down at the sweeping lawn. Leo was running across the vibrant green grass, chasing a golden retriever puppy we had adopted just last month. His laughter drifted up to the balcony, clear and completely unburdened. There was no tension in his small shoulders anymore. There were no hushed arguments for him to overhear, no suffocating expectations weighing him down. He was simply a child playing in the morning light, safe and entirely protected. My phone vibrated against the wrought iron patio table. I glanced at the screen. It was Naomi. I swiped to answer, placing the phone on speaker while I set my espresso cup down. "Good morning, Naomi," I said, keeping my eyes on Leo. "Tell me you have good news." "I always have good news for you, Eleanor," Naomi replied, her voice carrying that sharp, professional satisfaction I had come to deeply appreciate over the last half-year. "The federal prosecutor just called my office. The plea deals were officially rejected. David is remaining in federal custody awaiting trial. They are pushing for a minimum of 5 years. The judge denied bail entirely, citing him as a severe flight risk given the offshore accounts." I smiled, feeling a profound sense of rightness. The corporate vice president who had tried to gaslight me into an asylum was now wearing an orange jumpsuit, sleeping on a thin cot. "And Jamal?" I asked. Naomi let out a brief, dry laugh. "Jamal is sharing the exact same fate. The syndicate he owed money to cooperated with the feds to save their own skins. He is looking at identical time for wire fraud and conspiracy. Their brilliant venture capital ecosystem has been permanently relocated to a federal penitentiary." I nodded slowly, leaning back in my chair, feeling the morning sun warm my face. "What about the house?" "Foreclosed, seized, and auctioned off to a commercial developer," Naomi stated, reading from her notes. "Beatrice and Monica were formally evicted by the sheriff's department 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. The bank took absolutely everything to cover the defaulted loans. The precious Mercedes was repossessed the very next morning, right out of the driveway. They tried to claim it was a gift, but the paper trail proved it was purchased with stolen funds." "Where are they living now?" I asked, not out of pity, but out of a clinical need to know the final outcome of the parasites who had tried to drain me dry. Naomi paused, flipping a page. "You will appreciate this. They are currently renting a cramped 2-bedroom unit in a dilapidated trailer park on the far outskirts of the county. It is the only place that would accept them without a credit check or a cosigner." I let that image settle in my mind. Beatrice, the grand matriarch who once judged everyone by the brand of their shoes, now sharing a thin-walled trailer with her disgraced blackmailing daughter. The poetic justice was almost too perfect to articulate. They had demanded a traditional family structure, and now they had exactly that. Just the two of them, stripped of all the stolen wealth they used to elevate themselves above everyone else. "Oh, and one more thing," Naomi added, her tone turning slightly cautious. "Monica tried to reach out again. She attempted to call my office yesterday, begging for a line of credit. She claimed they could not afford the heating bill and that the family should help the family. I informed her that any further attempts to contact you or my firm would result in a harassment lawsuit." "You handled it perfectly, Naomi," I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Ensure her number remains permanently blocked across all channels. They are no longer my concern." "Understood, Eleanor," Naomi said. "Enjoy your weekend. You earned it." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the table. I closed my eyes and breathed in the fresh air. There was no lingering guilt. There was no societal pressure urging me to extend an olive branch or practice unconditional forgiveness. For years I had been force-fed the toxic narrative that family was an unbreakable bond, that blood demanded endless sacrifice regardless of the cost to my own sanity. I had been told to compromise to keep the peace to swallow my pride so men like David and Jamal could pretend to be kings while women like Beatrice and Monica applauded their delusions. That lie was finally dead. I did not forgive them. I would never forgive them. Forgiveness in this context was just another word for submission, and I was done submitting. I had taken a scalpel to my life and surgically removed a deeply malignant tumor. The Preston family had been a parasite feeding off my ambition, my income, and my silence. Cutting them out was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of extreme essential self-preservation. I realized standing there in the sunlight that the greatest victory was not seeing David in a federal holding cell or watching Beatrice lose her mansion. The true victory was the profound absolute silence in my own mind. The relentless anxiety was gone. The constant need to prove my worth to people who were inherently worthless had evaporated completely. The biggest lesson I took from the wreckage of my marriage was the absolute necessity of ironclad boundaries. Sometimes the world demands that you be ruthless. Sometimes being ruthless is the only possible way to protect the people you actually love. I had built an impenetrable fortress around myself and my son, and I would never apologize for dropping the portcullis on the people trying to burn it down. Down on the lawn, Leo threw a bright yellow tennis ball, and the golden retriever went tumbling after it in a chaotic, joyful flurry of paws and fur. Leo cheered, throwing his hands in the air, his laughter ringing like music. I picked up my espresso, finishing the last bitter drop. I smoothed the lapels of my silk morning robe. I was 34 years old. I was the sole owner of a thriving corporate career. I possessed total, absolute financial independence. I was a mother, a fighter, and the undisputed architect of my own reality. I had walked through the fire and forged myself into something completely unbreakable. I turned away from the balcony railing and walked back inside my beautiful, quiet home. The doors were locked, the future was entirely mine, and I was never going to look over my shoulder again. Have you ever had to walk away from people who only valued what they could take from you? Share your story in the comments. And if this story reminded you of your own strength, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next one.